I'm really grateful to Andrew for coming out with this exciting new volume. It comes at a very important time, especially given the fact that the lead author, Ghannouchi himself, has been in prison now for nearly a year. So unfortunately, he doesn't have a way of dialoguing with us in the public space. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your work, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I had about five different quick points of feedback that Andrew's presentation in this book generated for me. The first is the importance of recognizing the Tunisianness of Ennahda. So many people, when they talk about Ennahda, from Washington, D.C. to Abu Dhabi, they talk about it as if it's just a franchise, like the local McDonald's version of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And it's not, it never has been. And I think the chapter in Andrew and Ghannouchi's book that really highlights that is the chapter on Qutb and Benabi, because you've had that interesting generative tension, that almost dialectic between the two characters. Qutb representing the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and Benabi representing this much more secularly oriented type of Algerian nationalist critique. And Ghannouchi, as a young man, a lot of people don't recognize this, but he had an almost Steinbeckian journey from Damascus to France to Germany to Algeria. And he does all this traveling as a young man, and he toys around with different ideologies, and he's hanging out with Malik Benabi. And Benabi is a huge influence on him, as is Qutb and the Ikhwani thinkers in a different way. But so is the Zaytuna school of thought coming from Tunisia itself. And all of these things are mixing and churning together and influencing not only Ghannouchi, but his age mates and thought mates who create Ennahda in the 1970s. Which brings me to the second point that I think offers some important context here, which is Ennahda has a really unique internal organizational structure vis-a-vis a lot of other so-called Islamist parties. Unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it never cordoned women off into a separate qism, a separate division. There was always mixing between men and women. And unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't founded by one dude who took on a kind of czar-like guidance role. In fact, it was formed by four young men, one of whom was Ghannouchi, who were basically age mates in their teens and 20s. And they were in constant debate and dialogue with each other. So debate was a very, very important word for Ennahda's founders from the beginning. And then two of those four founders, Jorshi and Anaifer, they leave early on. And where do they go? They don't leave to defect to the right. They leave to defect to the progressive Islamists. And they stay in conversation with Ghannouchi. So he's having conversations with two of the four founders who left the movement precisely because they thought that Ghannouchi was too stuck in the Qutb, Ikhwani, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood styles of thinking, and they wanted Ennahda to highlight its Tunisianness more, which importantly influences Ghannouchi's thought, his evolution as a younger person, and the direction of the whole movement. So from the very beginning, in part because of all of these ideological and organizational factors, Ennahda, unlike a lot of other Islamist parties from Morocco to Turkey, wants to be a political party. It doesn't have this Hizb Haraka split that's so common for other Islamist movements. It's basically born political. It's a political animal, and it just wants to be legalized. And secondly, unlike a lot of other so-called Islamist parties in the region, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey's AKP, etc., it's not about justice and development, which are often the key words for Islamist parties. It's about democracy and opposing dictatorship and justice and development. So there's something added there. It's almost like the anti-Bourguiba party. It's these young men who feel so stifled by Bourguiba, along with the post-colonial critique and the more religious critique and everything else. That's a core part of their identity. The third point, when Tunisia goes into democratic transition in 2011, Ghannouchi has been doing all of this thinking for decades and decades that Andrew so beautifully summarizes and that his book so fantastically speaks to. And what's the point of all of that? How does that help or not? Well, I think, and I've seen this play out many, many times in my research in Tunisia since the transition in 2011 began, it gave Ghannouchi and it gave Ennahda more broadly an available democratic library of ideas, or a pro-democracy library of Islamic interpretation to quickly pull off the shelf. And Ghanouchi did that a lot of times, and other figures in Ennahda did that too. Now, sometimes it felt, even to members of Ennahda who I interviewed, a little bit forced, a little bit ex post facto. For example, when Ghanouchi was waffling about whether or not to stand with the lustration law that could have sunk Tunisia's transition by barring his main opponent, including, who was a Sabzi at the time, and his party, Nida Tunis, from standing in the 2014 elections. And Ennahda comes one vote close to passing that law and potentially sinking the democratic transition. And this is more hotly debated inside the party than any of the religious stuff.
Although some people would say that would have been the law that would have guaranteed the democratic transition.
Yes, there was a massive debate about this, a massive debate. Do we want to let our old torturers and their allies and the counter-revolutionaries come back into power? That's how the counter-argument, or the support of that law argument, sounded. Ghanouchi ultimately decides to swing against the law, and it doesn't pass, and he lobbies his caucus to vote against it. And he trots out these kind of ex post facto arguments like, well, the Prophet, how did he behave in Medina? He forgave the people who were fighting against early Islam. And I interviewed some members of Ennahda at the time at the base level who said, we feel like we know what he's doing. He's just trying to put lipstick on what we feel is a pig here to an extent. But it's smart. It might not feel right to us, but it feels smart. And there were all sorts of fascinating examples like that, where you saw ideas picked off the shelf at key moments, and that gave the party more ideological flexibility whilst enabling it to keep more of its base on board. Didn't always work. A lot of people in Ennahda left because of that and other decisions, but it was a fascinating process to watch play out. The fourth point out of 5, I'm almost done. I always found it interesting, and Andrew, maybe this is something you could speak to. I always found it fascinating how, when I interviewed people in Ennahda after the revolution about whether or not they were reading Ghanouchi before 2011 and after, not many people inside Ennahda were reading Ghanouchi, especially the young people. They were reading a lot of other folks. Sometimes they'd even have read more of like Marx than they'd read of Ghanouchi. Why do you think that is? Some people I spoke to, they said, well, we just feel like his writing was kind of dry, or, it's not a core part of the party's curriculum after 2011. I wonder if you'd come across that or anything. The fifth point, there emerged, as the years went by in Tunisia's decade-long democratic transition between 2011 and 2021, an increasing tension that became obvious to people within Ennahda and outside of Ennahda between Ghanouchi, the thinker, Ghanouchi, the philosopher, and Ghanouchi, the politician, Ghanouchi, the suit, Ghanouchi, the doer. And there were a lot of people, including inside Ennahda, maybe mostly inside Ennahda, more passionately inside Ennahda than anywhere else, who bristled at Ghanouchi increasingly wanting to wear the politician's suit and wanting more seats of power. And this caused a lot of debate within and outside the party. And a lot of people said, yeah, Sheikh, why don't you go write your memoirs or write some more reflections, hang out more with Andrew and contemplate how the democratic transition has changed your ideas over the years. But ultimately, he decided to hop into the political fray. And that was one of the factors. It certainly wasn't one of the top 10 factors, I would argue, but it was a factor that pissed off his opponents and led to, unfortunately, the return of dictatorship that we have today, which of course wasn't Ghanouchi's intention at all, but there was sort of a domino effect that got out of his control, and his leaping into politics was just one factor among many. I wonder, Andrew, if you asked him at all about that. Thanks again so much for an excellent contribution.